This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 578 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We get a couple of weeks like Week 9 each season, where very few things make sense. Like Josh Allen and the Bills failing to score a touchdown against the Jags, or how the Cowboys just fell flat on their face against Denver, or how the Rams couldn't do anything offensively against the Titans. Those are just a few examples of a really, really tough week in fantasy football. And that trickled into the sleeper show from last week a little bit too. Neither quarterback streamer even played this past week. News broke later in the week that Tua wasn't going to go and that Taysom Hill wouldn't be starter. But things were just really, really average with the picks. Jeremy McNichols didn't get the negative script that I thought that he'd get, so he didn't get as much work as I expected. And not only that, but even though the Titans won, their offense just didn't do a whole lot for fantasy. I also wasn't high on James Conner, which in hindsight was horrible. It was horrific. But I also didn't expect Chase Edmonds to get hurt. So that was at least a little bit of a weird one. Tommy Sweeney didn't work out as a deep sleeper, but he did run a ton of routes. So I'm not super mad about the process there. Jamal Agnew didn't work out either with a game script that wasn't easy to forecast at all. And even though Van Jefferson got the right kind of looks and the right kind of work, he had a disappointing 7-point outing in PPR formats. Not everything was horrible though. I liked Hunter Renfro's matchup and he had a nice game. I called out Pat Freiermuth and he obviously came through as well. And then Miami was my top streamer on the show and they crushed Tyrod Taylor and the Texans. What last week really showed, in my opinion, was how game-level projections can really hurt player-level ones. On a show like this one, we have to make assumptions. We have to tell stories about how a game might unfold in order to buy into a player who no one has rostered in fantasy football. When so many of those assumptions are wrong on multiple levels, the Bills, the Rams, the Cowboys, and so on, when that all hits in 1 week, it's tough. Fortunately, there were some good results in there that we can build off of here in Week 10. Now, before we get into the sleepers this week, I want to remind you that each week, FanDuel is offering fans the chance to win prizes by participating in daily fantasy football. The prize pool for the Sunday Million this week is a whopping $1.75 million. First place is taking home $300,000. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel.com today and click on the NFL Sunday Million contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy Sunday NFL football. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first tier includes players who are rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you could consider starting. I wanted to kick things off this week with Michael Gallup. It sounds like he's going to come off IR this week for the Cowboys against the Falcons. That's good. And even though I try to avoid using players coming off of injury, I think he's at least intriguing. The Falcons are a top half team in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and Gallup was pacing towards like a 15 to 20% target share in Dallas's Week 1 matchup against Tampa Bay before he got hurt. If he can see a 15 or so percent target share in this game, given the matchup and Dallas's implied team total of 32 points, I don't see why he doesn't have a shot to be a wide receiver 3 or a flex play. And this is also a reminder to add Michael Gallup if he's on your waiver wire. I have to go back to Van Jefferson this week. The peripheral numbers are absolutely there. I talked about this on the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week, but since Deshaun Jackson was phased out of this offense and then released, Jefferson has essentially ran the same number of routes as Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And like I said on that show, he has just 11 fewer air yards than Cooper Kupp over the last 3 weeks. And he's led the team in end zone targets during that time. Look, you never know. Maybe it doesn't hit for Jefferson. But process-wise, he's the type of player to take a risk on because his offense can be so good. Another player in this tier who I think that you can take a risk on is Rashad Bateman. I said I'd stop bringing him up on the 15 Transaction Show, but not this show. Bateman's not a bad play this week. Baltimore's got a 27-point implied team total against Miami, and Miami's been the 4th best matchup for wide receivers this year, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. And Bateman continues to see favorable target shares in this offense. He's averaged about a 19% target share per game since coming back from his injury and making his NFL debut. He could have a nice Thursday night. And then I've got one more player in this tier, Mark Ingram. Ingram should be rostered in far more leagues given the uncertainty around Alvin Kamara right now. Beat writer Nick Underhill reported that there were whispers that Kamara might have gotten a little bit banged up in week 9. And physical therapist Adam Hutchinson, who's at @realadam_H on Twitter, Adam and friend of the show Dr. Edwin Porras were speculating that there could be an ankle injury going on with Alvin Kamara. Now, none of this is set in stone as of this recording. Sometimes I just have to work off of speculation because we want to be ahead of the game. If something's going on there, then Kamara is in jeopardy of at least losing some work. And Ingram would be the one to see that work, given he's seen a 31% running back rush share and a 9% target share per game since rejoining the Saints. Definitely keep an eye on this situation. It could be huge for fantasy football. This next tier of players are guys who are rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, so we're getting a little bit deeper here. I think Ben Roethlisberger and Teddy Bridgewater are fine, safe streaming options this week. Fine enough. It's a really tough week for streaming. But if you're chasing ceiling and you're really hurting, I actually don't totally mind Taylor Heineke. Yes, he's been bad at times this year, and yes, he has just 3 touchdown passes over his last 4 games. But we've seen Washington lose by more than a touchdown in 4 games this year. Week 3 against Buffalo, Week 5 against New Orleans, Week 6 against Kansas City, and Week 7 against Green Bay. In 2 of those 4 games, Heineke had 8 rush attempts and 10 rush attempts. He had 5 against New Orleans too. But he finishes a QB1 option in both of those contests with 8 or more rush attempts. This week he gets Tampa Bay. The football team is a big underdog, and Tampa Bay has been a team that's forced opponents to throw the ball a lot this year, as we know. They're also the 12th best opponent for quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed. Heineke is risky. There's no doubt about it. But he's shown a ceiling because of what he can do with his legs, and I'm intrigued by that this week. In that same game and on that same team is Ricky Seals-Jones. I'll be brief with this recommendation because there's a chance that Logan Thomas plays. But at the time of this recording, Thomas is trending downward rather than upward. So if he doesn't go, RSJ does make sense because he's seen a target share of almost 17% without Logan Thomas this year. And Washington, like I just said, they could have a pass-heavy game script. Now, I think a safer tight end streaming option this week is Dan Arnold. Now, for the record, Pat Freiermuth is rostered in too many leagues now to even mention him on this show. But Arnold's percent roster number hasn't changed enough over the last handful of weeks. Arnold is second on the Jaguars in targets since DJ Chark's season-ending injury. And he faces a Colts defense that's 7th in raw points per game allowed to tight ends, but first when you adjust that for strength of opponent. So Dan Arnold is seeing a lot of volume and he has a great matchup. To me, he's in low-end tight end 1 territory. Now, Eno Benjamin was another player featured in the 15 Transactions column and podcast this week. And while he's a super risky play, I can understand if someone would need to throw him into like an RB2 spot or something because of bye week problems, or maybe you have Nick Chubb. Benjamin's snap rate wasn't very good against San Francisco, but he saw 29% of the Cardinals' running back rushes in that game. And he ended up finding the end zone on a really good run, a really impressive run. James Conner had a 19% target share in that game, but Benjamin's a capable pass catcher. I think they're going to utilize him in the passing game as well, especially because they may not want to run James Conner into the ground given his injury history. And now they're thin at the running back position. And Arizona's a 10.5 point home favorite this week. If they pull out to a nice positive game script, it should benefit the running backs. Now I've got one more guy in this tier, and it's someone I talked about last week, and that's Jamison Crowder. Crowder didn't do anything special in last week's matchup. And it wasn't really a plus matchup or anything. It was more of a play on his target share above all else. Now, of course, he ended up seeing his lowest target share of the season last week. But on a per game basis, Crowder's seen 18.5% of New York's targets this year. This week's matchup is not great against Buffalo, especially at first glance. But number one, Buffalo's a 13-point favorite according to FanDuel Sportsbook. That means the Jets could see a pass-heavy script. And number two, Crowder's played 84% of his snaps from the slot this year. And Buffalo ranks 4th in the league in percentage of targets that go to that area of the field. It's a bit of a desperation play, but Crowder is my favorite Jets pass catcher this week, for what that's worth. I love talking about this last tier of players. They're guys that no one wants in fantasy football. They're players who are rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. Now, I've talked about him a lot recently, but Jamal Agnew is still under that 10% mark. The Jags get the Colts this week, and Indianapolis is 8th in the league this year in slot yards allowed. Agnew has played a team-high 74% of his snaps from that area of the field, according to Pro Football Focus. and he's also leading the team in targets since DJ Chark's season-ending injury. He seems relatively safe in PPR formats this week to at least give you something. Now, I don't have the luxury of knowing every injury when I record this show every week. One injury I'm following, though, is with Chase Claypool. He has a toe injury and he could miss this week. If he does, James Washington gets a big bump. Claypool's been playing the second most snaps at wide receiver for Pittsburgh now that Juju Smith-Schuster is out of the picture. And Washington's played as the wide receiver 3. But if Claypool's out, Washington will slip into that role. And the Steelers get the Lions in a game where they have a 26-point implied team total. The Lions have actually been decent against wide receivers this year, ranking 25th in adjusted points allowed. But Washington would probably be in store for 5+ targets if Claypool doesn't play. That makes him a deep sleeper, especially with his big playability. Now, in that same game, I'm kind of interested in Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's not someone that you want to play in like DFS or anything because he has a limited ceiling. But St. Brown played 73% of Detroit's snaps the last time that we saw them, and he's primarily operated out of the slot this year. The Steelers traditionally get crushed by slot guys. This season, over 35% of the targets that they've faced have gone to that area. That's the 3rd highest rate in the league. So St. Brown works in deep PPR formats. Now, it's understandable if you don't want to dig that deep. A better option than St. Brown is Tyler Johnson. Antonio Brown is still banged up, and Chris Godwin apparently has an issue with his foot now. The Bucs have now played 3 games without AB this year. In those games, Tyler Johnson ran very clearly as the number 3 guy in that offense. He averaged a 10.4% target share per game. Now, that's nothing to write home about, but they get Washington this week. That's a team that ranks 1st in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. Johnson would have been a reasonable sleeper even without this Chris Godwin injury. But with this popping up, he's an even more intriguing option, especially if he can see more slot snaps. And then the last player in this tier, I've got a lot of players in this tier this week, but the last guy in this tier is Zach Pascal. Pascal has operated as Indianapolis' slot guy this year, and his target share numbers are actually pretty good. He has a 17% target share on the season, and his target share per game over the team's last 3 is 21.6%. Now he gets the Jags. The Colts have a high implied team total in this game of 29, and Jacksonville's not only ranked as the 11th best matchup for wide receivers when looking at adjusted points allowed, but they also rank 7th in slot yards allowed and 9th in target share allowed to the slot. Pascal's another pretty good floor option this week. The players to sit section has been hit or miss over the last few weeks. It started off really strong this year, but it's gotten more difficult as the season's gone on. And for those of you who don't know, this section of the show is dedicated to players who are rostered in 75% or more of Yahoo leagues who you could consider benching. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but Patrick Mahomes is not a lock. Like, yeah, if you have him, you're probably starting him. I get it. But this matchup against Vegas is really interesting. A huge problem for the Chiefs is their inability to generate explosive plays. Mahomes has thrown it 15 or more air yards on 15.5% of his passes this year. And he's completing just 39% of those throws. Over his 3 seasons as starter with Kansas City before this year, he was throwing it that distance on over 20% of his throws. And he was completing closer to 46% of those attempts. So he's been dramatically worse on 15+ air yard throws this year. Not just in frequency, but in completion rate as well. Meanwhile, Vegas has actually been the top team in the league at preventing big play throws. Quarterbacks have completed just 28% of those 15+ air yard throws against the Raiders. That's tops in the league. Mahomes hasn't been good in fantasy football. Let's not pretend he's been a stud, and I'm saying this out of nowhere. He's combined to score 32 fantasy points over his last 3 games. Justin Herbert almost hit that in week 9 alone. Again, I understand if you have to start him, but I think he is actually pretty risky. Let's move on to Courtland Sutton. We've now seen Sutton struggle a bit to see volume with Jerry Jeudy in the picture. Sutton scored fewer than 10 combined PPR points over his last 2 games while seeing a target share per game of only 12%. And Philadelphia, his opponent this week, they actually rank 31st in the league in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. I would much rather start Jerry Jeudy over Courtland Sutton. You can definitely temper expectations with Julio Jones as well. The dude's highest target share in a single game this year is 20.5%. He's hit double-digit PPR points just once this year, and it was in that game. New Orleans is the second best matchup in adjusted points allowed. But fantasy football is more than just matchups. You need better volume than what Julio's generating. So you can bench him in most cases this week. And then how about Antonio Gibson? The Buccaneers are great against the run. They rank 23rd this season in adjusted points allowed to running backs, but they've allowed the second fewest rushing yards to the position. I mentioned this earlier, but Washington has lost 4 games by more than a touchdown this year. And remember, they're 9.5-point underdogs this week. In those games, Antonio Gibson averaged just 46.5 rushing yards per game. And he saw just 2.3 targets per contest. Outside of that split, so in the 4 other games that they've played this year, Gibson's averaged almost 20 more rushing yards per game. And that includes a Week 8 contest where he barely played. He's been banged up, and the matchup is tough. I know most of you may not have a better option because running back is thin, but he's generally tough to trust this week. Now, as for defensive streamers, I think there are 2 main ones this week. I talked about Philadelphia on the 15 Transaction Show, and they still work. But don't sleep on Tennessee either. The Titans are a 3-point home favorite in a game with a 44.5-point over-under. And for as bad as the Titans' defense has been at times this year, they've at least been able to generate some pressure. They're average across the league in sack rate, but they're 11th in pressure rate. Hopefully they can use that to their advantage against a backup starter for New Orleans. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. We got one more show this week, the mailbag episode. That drops tomorrow.